Our ancient word this morning is from the book of Daniel, chapter 6, verses 1 through 9. It pleased Darius to appoint over the kingdom 120 satraps, stationed throughout the whole kingdom, and over them there were 3 ministers, one of them Daniel, to whom these satraps reported in order that the king not be troubled. This man Daniel surpassed the other ministers and satraps by virtue of his extraordinary spirit, and the king considered setting him over the whole kingdom. The ministers and satraps looked for some fault in Daniel's conduct in matters of state, but they could find neither fault nor corruption, inasmuch as he was trustworthy, and no negligence or corruption was to be found in him. These men then said, "We are not going to find any fault with this Daniel unless we find something against him in connection with the laws of his God." Then these ministers and satraps came thronging into the king and said to him, "O King Darius, live forever. All the ministers of the kingdom, the prefects, satraps, companions, and governors are in agreement that a royal ban should be issued under sanction of an oath that whoever shall address a petition to any god or man beside you, O king, during the next 30 days shall be thrown into a lion's den. So issue the ban, O king, and put it in writing so that it may be unalterable as a law of the Medes and Persians that may not be abrogated." Thereupon King Darius put the ban in writing. Our contemporary word is from the Serviceberry by Robin Kimmerer. Recognizing enoughness is a radical act in an economy that is always urging us to consume more. Data tell the story that there are enough food calories on the planet for all 8 billion of us to be nourished, and yet people are starving. Imagine the outcome if we each took only enough, rather than far more than our share. The wealth and security we seem to crave could be met by sharing what we have. Eco-psychologists have shown that the practice of gratitude puts brakes on hyperconsumption. The relationships nurtured by gift thinking diminish our sense of scarcity and want. In that climate of sufficiency, our hunger for more abates, and we take only what we need in respect for the generosity of the giver.
So why Daniel? Why are we hearing from Daniel on this first Sunday of Advent? Well, the book of Daniel has many potential meanings. You can read it on different levels, but basically, we can break that book into 2 parts. The first 6 chapters, and we heard from chapter 6, are incidents in the life of the royal court. And Daniel is a young Jewish man who has been trained to do all the things of the Jewish court. He's been taught the language, he's been taught the writing, the record keeping, and so on. And he's not the only one, but he stands out. And this is the 6th of many stories about Daniel and his companions. The second part is a series of visions, mostly what Daniel calls night visions, we might call dreams, in which he perceives events to come. The time of this is just before the end of the exile. So we're talking 6th century, late 530s, or early 530s, that's 538, 39, BCE, as we call it. And Daniel is, in his visions, he's looking ahead to what is to come. Now, in the Jewish tradition, the book of Daniel is called one of the writings. And in the writings, we have various stories that are teaching stories, wisdom stories, practical instruction. But in the Christian tradition, the book of Daniel is placed among the prophets. Daniel is seen as a model of obeying God and his visions. Here's one of his visions. This comes from chapter 7. I saw one like a human being coming with the clouds of heaven, and he came to the Ancient One and was presented before them. To them was given, to the human being was given dominion and glory and kingship, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that shall not pass away, and his kingship is one that shall never be destroyed. So in the context of the vision, this is talking about a particular time in history. But in Christian understanding of the prophecy, this one like a human being, sometimes called one like a son of man, is seen as Jesus. And this is seen as the foretelling of Jesus. Now, if we read this book of Daniel, it's full of satire and parody, especially the first 6 stories where the king is shown as, well, at best foolish, a bit of a dolt, someone who somehow makes a mistake and brings about some unfortunate event. The courtiers, the servants, the leaders are seen as conniving and jealous and greedy, cunning and malevolent. They're loyal and often incompetent. And the message overall is that this empire can be destabilized. Now, in the midst of this, the Jews in the court, such as Daniel, are shown as pious. They're shown as practical. They're shown as wise. They're shown as eloquent. So with all these exaggerated characteristics, we know that this is a bit of a political parody. But in this particular piece that we've heard today, we hear about a total restructuring of the kingdom. Darius has just come into power, and he's going to do things his way. And so he sets up the satraps, which is essentially like a provincial ruler underneath the ministers, the 3 ministers, one of them Daniel. And he creates a hierarchical bureaucracy, which there certainly was before, but perhaps structured in a different way. But it's centralized, and it requires a competent bureaucracy in order to operate. It requires, by the way, a large, what we would call scribal class in those times, people who know how to keep records of the appropriate things and send them in, who know how to collect the taxes and send them in, who know how to distribute the funds for building roads and bridges and so on. Requires this large bureaucracy. Now, the 2 other ministers, they are trying to forward their own careers, of course. Daniel simply does his job, but all are attempting to act with loyalty to the king, Darius. Really, the emperor, but called king in this story. And out of their own ambition and envy, the 2 other ministers go to the king, and they suggest that everyone in the kingdom recommends a new law, a new edict, a new decree that says for the next 30 days, anyone who prays to or makes a request of anyone other than the king, any god or any human, shall be thrown into a den of lions. That lion's den may be the first Daniel story we've ever heard as children, right? And it's upheld as Daniel's faith in God. That's the meaning of the story as we learn it there. So this law is passed. What could go wrong? What could go wrong? It's a way for them to show loyalty to the king, a way to show their dependence on the king's largesse, a way for the king to demonstrate his authority. What could go wrong? Well, if you remember the story, Daniel does end up in the lion's den, but he survives. And this is seen as a vindication of his God, because he was praying to God. There's a phrase that shows up several times in this story, and it begins, "O King Darius, live forever." This is how you address the king. Rule forever. Well, one of the things that happens in the course of the story is that, the overall story is that King Darius and everyone else are led to understood that no king lives forever, and that no one can manipulate the system to their own ends without bringing danger upon themselves. Now, throughout the book of Daniel, we see the Jewish people living in a hostile situation. They're dominated by a king, an emperor, a foreign king, and they must, to a certain extent, accommodate themselves to the situation in order to sustain themselves, their whole community. This is why Daniel continues to pray, because this is part of the tradition that sustains them and holds them together. But we can see this prayer of Daniel as a kind of resistance. It's a resistance to power, not in any overt way. That is, he's not declaring, "I'm resisting." He simply goes to his own home and prays. In front of the window, where he is seen, he is subverting the power of the king. But it is a satire. All is exaggerated. So why have such a book in the Bible? And setting aside the prophecy of Jesus that the Christians find for a moment, why write such a book? Well, we think that the book was recorded in about sometime in the 180s BCE. So essentially 350 years after the events that are told. But Daniel's visions, his dreams, foretell the time to come. And this is why the Christians read it as prophecy, because Daniel tells the history that comes after the time of Darius. Well, both before and after the time of Darius. He tells a history that he couldn't have known, and this is why it's seen as prophecy. And this is a common way of writing prophecy in these times, is to set yourself as if you're in an earlier time and then tell the history looking forward. But one thing that's been true through this time and through all the times is that there are Jews living in a diaspora, Jews who are spread into different parts of the empire. And in some ways, this book is a way to remind each other how to live in these circumstances when they are not in their own land, where they are not ruling themselves but are ruled by others. So we can see the king as ridiculous, and we can see the other ministers as foolish and envious and so on, malevolent, incompetent. But it's a way of taking apart this image of kingly power to remind themselves that kings are merely human. They do not live forever, and a kingdom does not last forever, which we do see repeatedly, even in this one book of Daniel. So they're taking apart this idea that the kings are special. They are just human beings who've risen to a certain powerful rank. And there's an irony in this story, because in this story, at the end, Daniel is restored. Daniel praises the king and lifts up the king, but those who plotted against him are thrown into the lion's den. So not only are these other ministers incompetent, but they are powerless to save themselves, unlike Daniel, whose God saved him from the lions. It's a wonderful story, and it has a lot of echoes at different times in history as people have struggled with rulers and emperors and governments of all kinds. This call to come back to the fundamentals of a tradition, this call to remember what is eternal and what is transitory. Human beings, even the human beings coming on clouds. God is eternal in some sense. God's dominion lasts forever. One of the challenges for us with stories like this is that the system of government described here is entirely hierarchical. There is one king at the top who holds power as long as he can keep it, and all beneath that king are expected to demonstrate their loyalty, are expected to meet the king's demands. And clearly from this story, we know that the various people still jockey for power underneath this one power. But there is this overarching hierarchy, the one with the most power down to the most common people who have none. Robin Kimmerer holds up an entirely different vision for us. In her book, The Serviceberry, she holds up the model of an ecosystem. And she says, what if, instead of seeing the gifts we receive as things for us to hoard, as things for us to use to dominate others, as things for us to protect ourselves, and what if instead we saw ourselves as part of the whole world community of beings and ecosystems? What if we recognized that our needs, in fact, are rather small, and that in an ecosystem undisturbed by humans, there's never one being who can be the richest one on the planet or the most powerful one on the planet, because all are interdependent. Even the lion, who we might have seen as the top of the food chain, is really one member of the whole web of life. We may not understand all of what each member does, but we know that each one contributes to the whole, and each one has a place, and each one is cared for. Well, we know that predation exists in nature, and we know that climates change and seasons come and go, so all is not always easy. But there is not a time when humans need to deprive others in order to sustain themselves. So this idea of recognizing enoughness, it's a hard one for us in this season when we're thinking about the gifts that we want to give to people because they don't yet have enough sweaters. They do not yet have enough electronic devices. They do not yet have enough movie tickets. Whatever it is that we are planning to give as gifts, as a gesture of our care for others, we're tempted to give those gifts that recognize not our enoughness and their enoughness, but rather that recognize our own desire for more. Now, this desire for more, of course, is shown throughout Daniel as well. The ministers want more power. They want more status. They want more ability to dominate. Those of us here are perhaps not looking for those desires to be fulfilled. Maybe a little bit. But the model that we have here of a hierarchy where the benefits go to the top and the domination comes down is so different from Kimmerer's model of an ecosystem of interdependent beings, of beings who sustain each other, sometimes in very surprising ways, like the ants who raise a fungus. They go get leaves and they raise a fungus in their nest, which is what they feed their larvae. Both the fungus and the ants, they need each other. One example. So Kimmerer says that the relationships nurtured by gift thinking diminish our sense of scarcity and want. And in that climate of sufficiency, I like that use of the word climate, our hunger for more abates, and we take only what we need in respect for the generosity of the giver. Now, if you don't know Kimmerer's work, she is a botanist and an ecologist, and she's also a professor in New York. She's also a Native American woman, and she understands the Native American tradition as well as the science tradition. And if you read her work, she kind of shows you how those traditions can work together rather than in opposition to each other. But this idea of the radical act of recognizing enoughness, so different from the hierarchy of King Darius. This radical act of saying, okay, I've got enough. Tough when there's a whole buffet of Thanksgiving food spread out and you could overfill your plate, right? This enoughness. If we can celebrate this enoughness, if we can share the enoughness, if we can, in fact, show each other and our communities and our cities and our states and our nation and the world enoughness, perhaps we can interrupt this desperate push for more, more, more. More wealth for the wealthiest, more power for the powerful, more luck for the lucky. And instead, say each one of us has a place. Each one of us has a place in this community here with each other, and we have room for more. If this enoughness can lead us into our Advent season, we might say that one candle provides enough light. One candle is enough to remind us that we have enough that we can go ahead and start hoping right now. This one candle can remind us that we can anticipate living out our own convictions. We don't need to follow the lead of others who are, what were my words there? We don't need to follow the leads of the cunning and malevolent, the loyalty to the temporary, the incompetence of greed. We don't need to follow because we have that light of hope. Our enoughness, our path, our anticipation. Amen.